The sun was just beginning to rise over the calm waters of a quiet lake tucked away in the Midwest. The air smelled fresh, like pine trees and damp earth after an early morning dew. For years, this little cabin by the water had been a safe haven. For its owner, a place where life slowed down and the world outside felt miles away. This wasn't some fancy vacation home with marble countertops or a hot tub. It was humble, cozy, and full of character. Every board creaked with stories, every corner held memories, and every window framed a view that made you want to sit still and breathe deeply. For as long as anyone could remember, the owner had cherished this spot. It wasn't about luxury here. It was about peace. A retreat from the noise of everyday life. Weekends were spent reading books on the porch, skipping stones across the glassy surface of the lake, or simply listening to the rustling leaves overhead. Life at the cabin moved at its own pace, and that's exactly how they liked it. But one crisp summer morning, everything changed. The tranquility was broken by the sound of tires crunching against gravel. Two police officers stepped out of their patrol car, their boots heavy on the ground as they approached the front door. Their knock echoed through the wooden walls, startling. The homeowner, who opened the door with confusion etched all over their face. "Good morning," one officer said politely, though his tone carried a hint of seriousness. "We've received a complaint about your property." "A complaint?" the homeowner asked, blinking in disbelief. "From who?" "It's come through the homeowners association," the other officer explained, glancing down at a clipboard. "They say there are some violations we need to address." This took a moment to sink in. Homeowners association? Violations? None of it made sense. The person standing in the doorway hadn't joined any HO, they didn't pay dues, attend meetings, or follow whatever rules these groups usually enforced. In fact, no one had ever mentioned anything about being part of such an organization when they bought the place years ago. Still, the officers pressed on, listing off supposed infractions. The dock extended too far into the lake, apparently, and there was something about a shed in the backyard not meeting code. As the conversation went on, frustration bubbled up inside them. How could someone claim authority over their land without so much as a heads up? But arguing with cops wasn't going to solve anything right then and there. So they nodded along, promised to look into it, and watched as the officers climbed back into their car and drove away. At first, they tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a simple misunderstanding. After all, living near a lake meant sharing space with neighbors, wildlife, and occasionally nosy people. Who knows, maybe someone saw the dock and thought it looked bigger than it actually was. Or maybe the shed really did stick out farther than allowed. Whatever it was, they figured it would blow over soon enough, but it didn't. Weeks later, another knock came at the door. Again, it was law enforcement. Again, with more complaints from the HOA. This time, the accusation seemed even stranger. Noise violations, despite rarely having visitors, improper landscaping, and rumors of illegal fishing activity. Each visit left the homeowner feeling more uneasy, more frustrated, and less sure of what to do next. What started as a minor annoyance quickly turned into something much bigger, a pattern of harassment that refused to go away. Determined to get answers, the homeowner dug into old paperwork related to the property purchase. There had to be some explanation for why this was happening. And then, buried deep within pages of legal jargon and outdated neighborhood covenants, they found something interesting. According to the documents, only properties within certain boundaries fell under the jurisdiction of the HOA, and their cabin sat squarely outside those lines. Armed with this discovery, they reached out to the HOA directly, hoping to clear things up once and for all. They sent letters, emails, and even attended a meeting explaining their findings and asking for the harassment to stop. But instead of backing down, the HOA doubled down. They hired lawyers, sent formal warnings, and continued pushing the issue until it became impossible to ignore. That's when the homeowner realized this wasn't just about docks or sheds anymore. It was about standing up for themselves, protecting their home, and refusing to let anyone take away the peace they'd worked so hard to build. With nothing left to lose, they decided to fight back, not just for themselves, but for everyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation someday. And so began a journey that would test their patience, resilience, and determination in ways they never imagined. Little did they know, this battle would lead to courtrooms, headlines, and ultimately, a victory that would change everything for them and for others like them. As the days turned into weeks, the situation only got worse. Each time the homeowner thought they'd finally put an end to the HOA's antics, another knock came at the door. It was like a never-ending cycle of tension and frustration. The visits from law enforcement became more frequent, and the accusations grew increasingly ridiculous. One day, it was about excessive noise, even though the cabin was miles away from the nearest neighbor and rarely hosted guests. Another time, it was a claim that the shed in the backyard wasn't up to code, despite the fact that it had been standing there for years without issue. The homeowner couldn't help but feel like they were being targeted. Why them? What had they done to deserve this kind of treatment? They weren't running a business out of the cabin or throwing wild parties late into the night. If anything, they were one of the quietest people on the lake. Yet, the HOA seemed determined to make their life as difficult as possible. Every visit left them feeling drained, anxious, and angry. They started dreading the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway, wondering what new accusation would come next. It wasn't just the accusations themselves that bothered them. It was the way the whole thing made them feel. Like they were being bullied. Like they didn't belong in their own home. The HOA acted like they owned the place, dictating what could and couldn't be done with property that wasn't even part of their jurisdiction. And every time the police showed up, it felt like a personal attack. Neighbors passing by would stop and stare, whispering among themselves. Some offered sympathetic smiles, while others seemed judgmental, as if they believed the homeowner must have done something wrong. To deserve all this attention. Frustration eventually gave way to determination. Enough was enough. The homeowner decided to dig deeper, determined to find proof that they weren't bound by the HOA's rules. They spent hours combing through old documents related to the purchase of the cabin. There were faded contracts, maps, and letters exchanged between lawyers during the sale process. At first, it felt overwhelming, all those pages of fine print and legal jargon, but then they stumbled upon something important. Buried deep within the outdated neighborhood covenants was language stating that only properties within certain boundaries were subject to HOA regulations. And guess what? Their cabin fell outside those lines. This discovery was a game changer. For the first time since the ordeal began, the homeowner felt a glimmer of hope. Armed with this information, they reached out to the HOA directly, presenting their findings and demanding an end to the harassment. They sent emails, made phone calls, and even attended a meeting to explain everything face to face. Surely, once the HOA saw the evidence, they'd back off, right? Wrong. Instead of admitting defeat, the HOA doubled down. They hired a team of corporate lawyers who sent formal letters warning the homeowner to comply with their demands or face legal consequences. The tone of these letters was cold and threatening, filled with phrases like failure to adhere and enforcement action. It was clear the HOA had no intention of backing down, no matter how weak their case might be. At this point, the homeowner realized they were dealing with something bigger than just a misunderstanding. This wasn't about docks or sheds or landscaping anymore. It was about power. The HOA wanted control, plain and simple. And because they had money and resources, they assumed they could push anyone around who dared to challenge them. But the homeowner wasn't about to roll over. They knew they were in the right, and they refused to let the HOA bully them into submission. With nothing left to lose, they decided to take the fight to court. Hiring a local attorney who specialized in property disputes, they prepared to sue the HOA for harassment, defamation, and abuse of power. It was a bold move, but after months of stress and sleepless nights, they were ready to stand their ground. Preparing for the lawsuit wasn't easy. It meant gathering evidence, tracking down witnesses, and reliving every painful moment of the past year. They spent countless hours going over details with their lawyer, trying to anticipate every argument the HOA might throw their way. It was exhausting, but also empowering. For the first time, they felt like they were taking charge of the situation, instead of letting it control them. Word of the impending lawsuit spread quickly through the small lakeside community. Some neighbors rallied behind the homeowner, offering support and sharing stories of their own run-ins with the HOA. Others sided with the organization, arguing that rules existed for a reason and everyone should follow them. Tensions ran high, and the atmosphere around the lake grew tense. Conversations that once revolved around fishing spots and weather patterns now centered on legal battles and property rights. Despite the mounting pressure, the homeowner remained focused. They knew this fight wouldn't be easy, but they also knew it was worth it. Every morning, they woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. Every evening, they sat on the porch overlooking the lake, reminding themselves why they were doing this. This cabin wasn't just a piece of property. It was a sanctuary, a place where memories were made and dreams took shape. No amount of intimidation or legal threats was going to take that away. As the court date approached, emotions ran high. Friends and family encouraged the homeowner to stay strong, while others warned them not to underestimate the HOA's influence. But none of that mattered. They had come too far to turn back now. Whatever happened in court, they knew they'd given it their all, and that alone was a victory in itself. Little did they know, the battle ahead would test them in ways they couldn't imagine. The courtroom would become both a battleground and a stage where truths would be revealed, alliances would shift, and justice would hang precariously in the balance. But one thing was certain. When it was all said and done, nothing would ever be the same again, not for the homeowner, not for the HOA, and not for the tight-knit community surrounding the lake. The courtroom was a far cry from the peaceful surroundings of the cabin by the lake. Instead of the soothing sound of water lapping against the shore, there was the hum of fluorescent lights and the shuffle of papers. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and stale coffee. It was an unfamiliar world for the homeowner, intimidating, formal, and packed with people who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. But despite the nerves bubbling in their stomach, they walked into that room ready to fight. On one side of the aisle sat the HOA's team, a group of sharp-suited lawyers armed with thick folders and confident smiles. They looked untouchable, like they'd seen it all before and always came out on top. On the other side was the homeowner, sitting alongside their attorney, a local lawyer named Mark, who had a reputation for taking on tough cases. He wasn't flashy or overly polished, but he had a quiet confidence that made his client feel like maybe, just maybe, they stood a chance. As the trial began, the atmosphere shifted. What had started as whispers and murmurs among spectators turned into tense silence as the judge entered the room. Everyone rose to their feet, and the weight of the moment settled heavily on everyone present. For the homeowner, this was more than just a legal battle. It was personal. Every word spoken in that courtroom felt like it carried the potential to change their life forever. The HOS lawyers kicked things off with a strong opening statement. They painted a picture of a harmonious community disrupted by someone refusing to play by the rules. Our organization exists to maintain order and preserve property values, one of them said, pacing slowly in front of the jury. When individuals ignore these guidelines, it affects everyone. That's why we're here today, to ensure fairness and accountability. It was a compelling argument, delivered with practiced ease. To anyone unfamiliar with the situation, it might have sounded reasonable. But the homeowner knew better. This wasn't about fairness or harmony. It was about control. And as much as the HOA tried to frame themselves as protectors of the neighborhood, their actions told a different story. When it was their turn to speak, Mark stepped up. His approach was different. He didn't rely on grand gestures or dramatic flair. Instead, he focused on facts. Calmly and methodically, he laid out the evidence proving that the homeowner's cabin fell outside the boundaries governed by the HOA. He pointed to maps, deeds, and covenants showing how clear the lines were drawn. Then he addressed the repeated police visits, arguing that they constituted harassment rather than legitimate enforcement. We're not talking about minor disagreements over landscaping or dock placement, Mark said, his voice steady but firm. This is about a systematic effort to intimidate someone into compliance, even though they're not legally obligated to comply. My client has been subjected to baseless accusations, threats, and public embarrassment, all because they dared to stand up for their rights. Witnesses were called to testify, and each side worked hard to sway the judge's opinion. First up was a neighbor who supported the HOA. She described herself as a longtime resident of the area and spoke passionately about the importance of following rules. If one person gets away with breaking them, it sets a bad precedent. She said, "It's unfair to those of us who work hard to keep our properties nice." Next, another neighbor took the stand, but this time the testimony went in favor of the homeowner. This man had lived on the lake for decades and knew the history of the community well. He talked about how the HOA had become increasingly aggressive over the years, targeting anyone who questioned their authority. They don't care about fairness, he said. They care about power, and if you cross them, they'll make your life miserable. The tension in the room grew thicker with every witness. People leaned forward in their seats, hanging on to every word. Even the judge seemed more engaged now, jotting down notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. For the homeowner, watching these testimonies unfold was both validating and infuriating. Hearing others share similar experiences reminded them they weren't alone. But it also highlighted just how widespread the problem really was. As the days dragged on, the arguments became more heated. The HOA's lawyers accused the homeowner of deliberately trying to undermine the community's stability. Meanwhile, Mark countered by pointing out inconsistencies in the HOA's claims and questioning their motives. At one point, tempers flared when the opposing counsel suggested the homeowner had fabricated evidence, a claim Mark shot down immediately, slamming his hand on the table for emphasis. "You can look at the documents yourself," Mark said, his tone sharp enough to cut through the tension. "These aren't opinions, these are facts. Facts that prove my client's case." By the end of the trial, it was clear that both sides had given everything they had. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the judge announced that a verdict would be delivered soon. As the homeowner left the building that day, they felt a mix of emotions, exhaustion, anxiety, and a flicker of hope. No matter what happened next, they knew they'd fought as hard as they could. Back at the cabin, the wait felt endless. Days stretched into weeks, and every knock at the door sent their heart racing. Was it the verdict? Or was it yet another letter from the HOA? Despite the uncertainty, they refused to let fear take over. Instead, they focused on small victories, spending time outdoors, writing in their journal and reminding themselves why they loved this place so much. Finally, the call came. Their attorney's voice on the other end of the line was calm but triumphant. "We won," he said simply. Those two words hit like a tidal wave, washing away months of stress and frustration. Justice had been served not just for them, but for anyone else who had ever felt powerless against an organization like the HOA. But even as relief washed over them, they knew the journey wasn't entirely over. Winning the lawsuit was a major step, but rebuilding trust within the community and reclaiming the peace they once cherished would take time. Still, standing on the porch overlooking the lake that evening, they allowed themselves a moment of quiet celebration. The road ahead might still be uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like they were finally heading in the right direction. The day of the verdict arrived and the courtroom was packed. People from all over the lakeside community had shown up, some out of curiosity, others out of solidarity, and a few because they wanted to see how far the HOA's influence could reach. The air buzzed with whispered conversations, feet shuffling nervously, and the occasional creak of old wooden benches. The homeowner sat quietly, hands clasped tightly in their lap, trying to steady their breathing. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. When the judge finally entered the room, the chatter died down instantly. Everyone stood as he took his seat, his expression unreadable behind thick-rimmed glasses. Papers were shuffled, and, for what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. Then the judge cleared his throat and began to speak. His voice carried authority, cutting through the tension like a knife. After carefully reviewing the evidence presented during the trial, the judge delivered his ruling. The homeowner was not required to join the HOA or follow its rules. Their property fell outside the designated boundaries outlined in the neighborhood covenants, making them exempt from any obligations tied to the organization. Furthermore, the repeated police visits orchestrated by the HOA were deemed unnecessary and harassing. The judge didn't mince words. He made it clear that the HOA's actions went beyond enforcing guidelines and crossed into intimidation territory. But the surprises didn't stop there. In addition to dismissing the HOA's claims, the judge awarded the homeowner substantial damages for emotional distress and lost enjoyment of their property. He also ordered the HOA to issue a public apology and cease all further attempts to interfere with the homeowner's use of their land. As the gavel struck the desk, signaling the end of the case, the courtroom erupted. Supporters of the homeowner clapped and cheered, while members of the HOA sat frozen in stunned silence. Some looked angry, others embarrassed, but none dared to argue with the decision. For the homeowner, relief washed over them in waves. It was overwhelming, not just because they'd won, but because they'd proven something bigger, that standing up for yourself, no matter how daunting it seemed, could lead to justice. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, eager to hear the story. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and questions came rapid fire. How does it feel to win? What message do you have for others facing similar situations? Do you think this will change how HOAs operate? The homeowner paused for a moment, taking it all in. They hadn't expected this kind of attention, but now that it was here, they realized it was an opportunity to share their experience, to encourage others, and to shine a light on the dark corners of power dynamics within communities like theirs. It feels incredible, they said, their voice steady despite the whirlwind around them. But more than anything, I hope this shows people that they don't have to accept being bullied. You can stand up for your rights, even when it feels impossible. And if you're persistent enough, sometimes you can win. Those words resonated deeply, especially among those who had been watching the case unfold. Back at the lake, neighbors talked about the verdict for days. Some celebrated openly, happy to see the HOA taken down a peg. Others grumbled under their breath, convinced the ruling set a dangerous precedent. But everyone agreed on one thing: the balance of power in the community had shifted. For years, the HOA had operated unchecked, assuming their authority couldn't be questioned. Now, cracks were starting to show in that facade. In the weeks following the trial, the HOA scrambled to clean up its image. A hastily written apology letter appeared on their website, though it lacked the sincerity many felt it deserved. Behind closed doors, leadership meetings turned heated as board members pointed fingers and debated next steps. Fearing backlash, they scaled back some of their stricter enforcement tactics and promised to review their policies. Whether these changes were genuine or simply damage control remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: their grip on the community wasn't as tight as it used to be. For the homeowner, life slowly began returning to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could get after such a tumultuous experience. The first thing they did was take down the makeshift signs warning visitors about trespassers that they'd put up during the height of the conflict. Next, they started fixing things around the cabin that had fallen into disrepair during the chaos. The dock got patched up, the shed received a fresh coat of paint, and wildflowers were planted along the shoreline to brighten the space. Each small improvement brought a sense of renewal, not just to the property, but to their spirit. Still, the scars of the ordeal lingered. Nights were quieter than before, but sleep didn't always come easily. Memories of tense courtroom exchanges and late-night worries crept in uninvited. Yet, alongside those memories was a newfound resilience. The homeowner had faced something terrifying head-on and come out stronger on the other side. That knowledge gave them courage, a reminder that even when the odds seem stacked against you, standing your ground can make all the difference. Word of the victory spread quickly beyond the lake, thanks in part to local news coverage and social media. Strangers reached out, sharing their own stories of battles with HOAs and asking for advice. Some sought legal guidance. Others just needed reassurance that fighting back was worth it. Moved by the response, the homeowner decided to create a blog dedicated to helping others navigate similar challenges. They wrote posts breaking down complex legal terms, shared tips on gathering evidence, and offered moral support to anyone feeling overwhelmed. Before long, the blog gained traction, attracting readers from across the country. People commented on articles, exchanged ideas, and formed a sort of online support group. What started as a personal project grew into something much larger, a movement focused on empowering individuals to challenge unfair systems. The homeowner never imagined their fight would inspire so many, but seeing the impact kept them motivated to keep going. Despite the progress, tensions in the community weren't completely resolved. While some neighbors warmed up, offering friendly waves or stopping by to chat, others remained distant. A handful continued to side with the HOA, muttering complaints about people thinking they're above the rules. But the homeowner didn't let that bother them too much. They knew not everyone would agree, and that was okay. What mattered most was staying true to themselves and protecting the sanctuary they'd worked so hard to preserve. Visiting the cabin became joyful again. Mornings were spent sipping coffee on the porch, watching mist rise off the lake. Afternoons involved reading books or tinkering with projects around the yard. Evenings brought golden sunsets reflected in the water, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. These moments reminded the homeowner why they'd fought so hard in the first place. This place wasn't just a piece of property, it was a haven, a retreat from the noise of the world. And now it felt safe once more. Looking back, the journey had been anything but easy. There were times when giving up seemed like the only option. Days when doubt crept in, whispering that maybe the HOA was right, that maybe they should just give in and move on. But every time those thoughts surfaced, the homeowner pushed them aside, reminding themselves of what was at stake. Not just their home, but their dignity, their independence, and their right to live peacefully without interference. Winning the lawsuit wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a lesson in perseverance, resilience, and the importance of standing up for what's right. It taught them that even the smallest voices can make a big impact when they refuse to stay silent. And as they stood on the porch one evening, listening to the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore, they knew they'd done the right thing. The battle may have been exhausting, but the peace they found on the other side was worth every second of it. Months had passed since the trial, and life by the lake began to return to a rhythm that felt almost familiar. The homeowners spent their days rebuilding not just their property, but also their sense of peace. It wasn't easy, there were still moments when the memory of those tense courtroom battles or the endless knocks on the door crept into their thoughts. But with each sunrise over the water, they found it easier to let go of the weight that had once pressed so heavily on their shoulders. The cabin itself started to reflect the changes happening within them. Repairs long delayed finally got done. The dock was reinforced, the shed painted a cheerful shade of blue, and flower beds sprouted vibrant blooms along the edges of the yard. These small acts of restoration weren't just about fixing things, they were symbolic. Each nail hammered, each brushstroke applied, felt like reclaiming a piece of themselves. The cabin wasn't just standing again, it was thriving, much like its owner. But the transformation went beyond the physical space. Something inside the homeowner had shifted too. Before all this, they might have described themselves as quiet, maybe even hesitant to draw attention. Now, they carried a quiet confidence, born from knowing they'd stood up for what was right, even when it felt impossible. They realized that courage isn't about never feeling afraid. It's about moving forward despite the fear. And now, every time they sat on the porch overlooking the shimmering lake, they felt proud not just of winning the case, but of how far they'd come in the process. The community around the lake also began to change, albeit slowly. Some neighbors who had once kept their distance now approached with warm smiles and kind words. "We're glad you stuck it out," one said during a chance encounter at the local market. Others invited them to barbecues or fishing trips, gestures that felt like olive branches after months of tension. Not everyone warmed up, of course. A few continued to side with the HOA, casting disapproving glances whenever they crossed paths. But the homeowner didn't dwell on it. They understood that not everyone would agree, and that was okay. What mattered was staying true to themselves. Word of their victory spread further than they ever imagined. Local newspapers ran follow-up stories highlighting the broader implications of the ruling. Online forums buzzed with discussions about HOAs and individual rights, with many pointing to the case as an example of how ordinary people could challenge powerful organizations. Strangers reached out via email or social media, sharing their own struggles and seeking advice. Many expressed gratitude, saying the homeowner's story gave them hope when they needed it most. Inspired by these messages, the homeowner decided to take their advocacy a step further. Their blog, which had initially been a personal outlet, evolved into something bigger, a platform dedicated to empowering others facing similar battles. They wrote detailed guides explaining legal terms and procedures in simple language, posted tips on documenting evidence, and shared motivational stories from readers who had stood up to HOAs in their own communities. The response was overwhelming. People commented, shared their experiences, and formed connections, creating a virtual support network that spanned states and even countries. To keep the momentum going, the homeowner organized online workshops, where experts, lawyers, real estate agents, and community organizers spoke about navigating conflicts with HOAs. These sessions became wildly popular, drawing participants eager to learn how to protect their rights. For the first time, the homeowner realized they weren't alone in this fight. There was a whole community of people out there, united by shared frustrations and hopes for change. Being part of that movement gave them a renewed sense of purpose. Back at the lake, the seasons began to shift. Summer faded into autumn, painting the trees in fiery shades of red and gold. The cooler air brought crisp mornings and cozy evenings by the fireplace. Life moved at its usual slow pace, punctuated by the occasional sound of geese flying overhead or leaves rustling in the breeze. The homeowner cherished these moments, finding solace in the simplicity of nature. It reminded them why they had fought so hard to preserve this place, to keep it untouched by unnecessary drama and conflict. One evening, as they sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, a neighbor stopped by unannounced. He lived a few cabins down and had always been friendly, though they hadn't spoken much during the height of the legal battle. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, gesturing toward the empty chair beside them. They nodded, curious about what. He wanted to say, "I've been meaning to thank you," he began, settling into the seat. "Your fight, it inspired me to stand up too. Last month, I finally told the HOA I wasn't paying for that ridiculous landscaping fee they tried to charge me. I figured if you could take them on, so could I." The homeowner smiled, surprised by the impact their actions had made. "I'm glad to hear that," they replied. "Honestly, I didn't think anyone would notice. I just wanted to protect my home." "Well, you did more than that," he said. "You showed us we don't have to sit back and let them walk all over us. You gave us hope." Hope, the word lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. As the two sat there talking under the stars, the homeowner realized their victory wasn't just about them anymore. It had sparked something larger, a ripple effect that encouraged others to speak up, to push back against unfairness, and to believe in their ability to make a difference. Over time, the HOS presence in the community grew quieter. They restructured their leadership, toned down their aggressive tactics, and focused on more practical matters like road maintenance and trash collection. While some skepticism remained, there was no denying that the organization had lost a significant amount of power. Neighbors joked that the HOA board members avoided eye contact at meetings now, embarrassed by the public scrutiny they'd faced. 4. The homeowner, the most rewarding part of it all was seeing the cabin restored to its original purpose, a sanctuary. No longer overshadowed by fear or frustration, it once again became a place of refuge. Weekends were spent reading, writing, or simply sitting by the water, watching the ripples dance across the surface. Evenings brought quiet reflection, often accompanied by a cup of tea and the soft glow of lantern light. It was everything they'd dreamed of when they first bought the property and more. Looking back, they knew the journey hadn't been easy. There were sleepless nights, moments of doubt, and times when giving up seemed like the only option. But through it all, they held onto one truth: this place was worth fighting for. Not because it was perfect, but because it represented something greater: freedom, independence, and the right to live without unnecessary interference. As winter approached, blanketing the landscape in snow, the homeowner reflected on how far they'd come. The cabin stood strong, weathering storms both literal and figurative. So did they. And while the scars of the past would always remain, they served as reminders of resilience, not just theirs, but of everyone who refused to back down in the face of injustice. In the end, the battle wasn't just about docks, sheds, or property lines. It was about standing firm in the face of intimidation, about believing in your right to live peacefully, and about inspiring others to do the same. For the homeowner, the victory wasn't just a win in court. It was proof that sometimes the smallest voices can spark the biggest changes. And as they gazed out at the frozen lake, bathed in moonlight, they felt at peace, not just with the world around them, but with themselves.